I feel like we should have a drink.
I think we would be remiss.
We have to.
I think we're professionally obligated to drink. Yeah.
There we go.
That's nice.
If we're doing a podcast about drinking, it just makes sense. We should have at least a small.
So historically, there's been a safety feature built into alcohol. So for most, we've been drinking. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Yeah. Let's try this.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's nice.
That'll start your Monday morning.
I'll start your Monday. That's a way to start a Monday morning. Yeah. So this stuff is new. So having alcohol that's this strong is something we've only had for a couple hundred years.
Really?
Yeah. So a lot of people don't realize that. So for most of our history, we've been drinking like 2 to 3% beers.
2 to 3%.
Yeah, historically it's typically what beers came in at. Grape wines you could get up to like 8 to 10, but there's a built-in limit to natural fermentation. So the yeast are turning sugars into alcohol, which is a poison. So the yeast are slowly poisoning themselves, basically. And we've bred these super hardy yeast. So like nowadays you can get an Australian Syrah up to like 16% ABV.
Wow.
Which is high, historically really unprecedented. But
that's crazy.
That's as high as you can get because then the alcohol shuts down the yeast. But a way around that is distillation. So you take that wine, you heat it up. Ethanol is really volatile, so that comes off first. And if you could figure out how to capture that vapor and turn it back into a liquid, you've got this. You've got really concentrated alcohol.
Do they do that with wine?
They do it with wine, or they'll take something that's naturally fermented, so a weak beer or a wine, and then they distill it.
And what do they call that when they get it on the other end?
Distilled liquor. That's what liquor is.
Oh, okay. So it's just a kind of liquor?
Yeah. Like so liquor or spirits refers to something that's been distilled. So you've basically extracted the alcohol out of the mixture and made it into a pure form. And once you do that, you've got like 90, you can get like some vodkas could be like 90-something% ABV. So that's crazy strong. It's just really, we're not equipped to, what you're talking about, it needs to be modulated. It was always modulated historically by the fact that we were drinking beers that weren't very strong. So there's going to be just volume limit to how much you can consume. It's also modulated by social stuff. So we're drinking typically, historically, in a communal situation where there's really clear ritual restrictions on drinking. So you only drink when someone makes a toast. You're modulating your drinking with other people. And even, you think about just even in a pub, you don't just drink as much as you want. You order rounds.
Right.
And if you down your beer real fast, you got to wait until everyone else is ready to order another round. So we socially regulate our drinking, and then it's been regulated by its inherent weakness, if you want to think of it that way. But then all of a sudden you get this kind of stuff. You get really strong liquors, and you can have that in your house. That's when alcohol gets really dangerous.
And it's only been the last couple hundred years.
Yeah, distilled liquors weren't, because the concept's really simple. Aristotle described distillation, but technologically it's really hard to do because you have to have metallurgy. You need to be able to heat liquids and keep them at a certain temperature.
That makes sense.
They're pressurized. It's actually kind of dangerous. So in Prohibition, when people created stills at home, it was like early 20th century version of meth labs. They were constantly exploding and people were like getting scalded with hot liquid because it's dangerous. So it's hard to do. So we only mastered it. I'm telling an evolutionary story. So my story begins 10 million years ago with primate ancestors who adapted to alcohol. And 10 million years ago, about 20,000 years ago to 13,000 years ago, we start making alcohol seriously, not just relying on fruit lying around that has some alcohol in it. And then distillation happens probably around 1300s in China and 1600s in Europe. So that sounds like a long time ago, but really, evolutionarily, it's yesterday. We really haven't had time culturally or genetically to adapt to access to this kind of alcohol.
And a long time ago when people were drinking beer and drinking wine in particular, like a lot of what they were doing, like if they were carrying it around with them, they would carry beer or wine when they were going on trips because it didn't go bad the way water would, right?
Beer, unhopped beer, goes bad pretty quickly.
Like
a couple
water?
days. Yeah. There's a theory that beer might have been useful in some cultures because fermenting water purifies the water. So
right,
if
so
you've
if you
got
have bad water from a pond or something like that, and then you ferment it and make beer out of it,
you
you
can
drink it.
So that's one of the stories. I mean, the purpose of my book is to try to explain the puzzle of why we do this. Why do we put poisons into our body? Why do we like to drink? And it's mysterious because it's really costly. It's damaging physiologically. It's got all these potential social problems. And yet we've been doing it forever. We've been making and drinking alcohol for just about as long as we've been doing anything in an organized fashion. In fact, it's looking likely that we were doing this before agriculture, and that it's possible that the desire to make beer and wine is what motivated agriculture. So hunter-gatherers were making beer before they had agriculture.
Really?
Yeah. And
so they're making in clay pots and
there's they're pounding the stuff, they're malting it to up the sugar content. I think that's the effect of that, and then they're fermenting it. And so we have these sites like in what's present-day Turkey, the site called Göbekli Tepe is this really cool ritual site. It's these huge stone. Have you seen pictures of it?
Yeah, I'm super familiar with it because of Graham Hancock, who's been on my podcast multiple times.
Okay. My understanding of the site is that
it's a hunter-gatherer.
It was hunter-gatherers. There's no grain storage locations. They were clearly gathering. They were coming from all over, and they were gathering at this site to build. So they were working to erect these pillars and stuff, and they were having blowout feasts. So they have all these remnants of feasting, and they have these big vats that almost certainly contained beer and possibly hallucinogen-laced beer. So a lot of early.
And so these hunter-gatherers, they weren't growing the hops or whatever they made the beer out of. They were just finding it wild.
They're making it out of wild grains. But the argument, so the standard story about alcohol is, we invent agriculture. Then sometime after that, we note that someone leaves their sourdough starter out too long and it starts to turn into beer, and they're like, oh, this actually tastes all right. That's the standard story. So we had agriculture, and then we get alcohol. Around the 1950s or so, some archaeologists started to argue, sites like this one and other sites around the world suggest that hunter-gatherers were gathering and making alcohol before agriculture. And so this is the beer before bread hypothesis.
That's crazy.
Is that what motivated people to settle down and start focusing on making these grains more productive? Was they wanted to get high, not because they wanted to make bread. And it jives. You see the same pattern in other parts of the world. So in South America, they make this beer-like substance, chicha, now they make it out of maize, out of corn. But they used to make it out of the wild ancestor of corn is called teosinte. And what's interesting is teosinte sucks for making grain. Like if your goal was to make tortillas, you wouldn't even notice this plant because the grains don't make very good grain products to eat. But it makes great beer. It's really good for making chicha. So this plant, if these early people were looking for something to make food with, they would overlook this plant. But if they were looking for something to make beer with, they would focus on it, cultivate it, start making it produce bigger grains, and that's how you would get corn.
That's like, what was do we know what the original thing that they got high with was? Do we have the first, the atom?
Yeah. I mean, certainly we were getting a little bit drunk on just naturally fermenting fruit. So, if fruit falls on the ground, it starts to rot. What the rotting is some of it's being turned into alcohol by yeast. And so it's easy to discover alcohol because it's happening naturally in our environment all the time. The earliest evidence of deliberately produced alcohol is from about 13,000 years ago, so a little bit before Göbekli Tepe. And this is in modern-day Israel. They have traces of beer production, so people were clearly fermenting beer